Hello, everyone. We are very happy that you are again with us, listening or watching our podcast. Here is Jan, currently in Prague.
Yeah, here's Dan, currently in the South Bohemia, and here's our dear guest.
Hello, Paul Jones here from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we are very happy that currently we are, as you know from us, we are running our, let's call it, U.S. election lineup. We got Peter Ruff from Hudson Institute. We got guys from Atlantic Council, and this next 30-40 minutes we will talk about how future U.S. administration will behave towards us as a foreigners. And for that, we cannot have a better guest than Ambassador Paul Jones, who was U.S. ambassador to Poland, just next door from us, who are residing here in Czech Republic. Before that, he also served ambassador to Malaysia. He was also chargé d'affaires to Pakistan. He worked in U.S. Department of State and U.S. Foreign Service, I think, for more than 35 years, if I'm not mistaken.
33, yeah.
33 years. And after retirement, he is working with well-known legal attorneys. Sorry if I pronounce it badly. Patton, Squire, and Boggs. Am I right?
Squire, Patton, Boggs, but it's okay, yeah.
So I will probably start with the first question. We have a script here, but I would like to start with another question, because there was a funny moment in the last days in the U.S. election campaign, concretely on Donald Trump race in Pennsylvania, where Elon Musk openly supported Donald Trump. There was a famous picture on the Twitter with the cap, "Make America Great Again," and it seems when we look at the polls and when we look at the poly market bets on both candidates, we can see that the race toward end will be very narrow. Yeah, this is very tight. And I would like to ask whether Elon Musk, as a controversial person with a lot of supporters and a lot of rejectors, is able to be like the tongue on the scales and to push the tongue toward one or the other side. What is your opinion on that?
Well, thanks, Dan, and it's a pleasure to be with you and talk about a subject near and dear to my heart: the U.S. elections and international perceptions. I'm not an expert on the domestic dynamics. I will just offer my opinion as a relatively informed American. I don't think that's going to tip the scales one way or the other very much. I think the vast majority of voters have already made up their mind about who they're going to support. A lot depends on who turns out. And I think who actually casts their ballot among those supporters, and then a very small number who maybe have not made up their mind yet. I don't think Elon Musk's support to Donald Trump is going to be decisive in any of those constituencies.
Okay, Hansa, now it's your turn. Oh, Hansa is frozen, probably. Okay, so I can continue. It's logical that we, as foreigners, look at U.S. elections from our own perspectives. We are both from Europe, and trying to understand how the future president and their administrations, either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, will behave toward the world. So our first question is that, are foreign issues important to Americans as electoral topics? And if so, what resonates the most?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think, on issues, Americans, like voters in most countries, they vote predominantly on domestic issues, whether it's the economy, healthcare, et cetera. And when you go down the list to get to the foreign policy issues, they're usually issues that are sort of domestically linked, like protect the country from terrorism, stop illegal drugs, stop immigration. But what this election in particular, I'd say, is about is leadership on the world stage. And I think voters are motivated by how they perceive a president being able to be attuned to the moment in the world, being able to deal with wars. We've got wars in Europe and the Middle East, potential wars, possibly in Asia. And foreign policy is where a president is, the leadership is clearest and unfettered by other institutions of Congress and others in the United States largely. So I think that's why you saw in the Harris-Trump debate quite a discussion on the different approaches to leadership in a dangerous world. And Trump made the case, his critique of the Biden-Harris team is that they're weak on the world stage, and that weakness leads to wars and chaos. His case for himself is that he's a strong leader, and world leaders fear him. So therefore, they won't start wars or won't cross the United States while he's in charge. And he further says only he can bring peace to Ukraine and Gaza because he understands how to wield power on the international stage. Now, Harris, her critique of Trump is that he's actually not strong, and his global negotiations he tried were not successful. And as she puts it, he's a sellout to dictators around the world who flatter him. She claims that what she brings to the leadership for the United States and the world is relying on American strengths of its alliances, its values, and a consistent approach to the world that will that will enable the United States to achieve its agenda. A little subplot that's interesting and that has been much discussed is the particular war in Gaza is a problem for the Democrats, including for Harris, because they've got strong constituencies among supporters of Israel and also constituencies who are very sympathetic to the Palestinians. And in two swing states, so this election is going to be decided on very close margins in about 7 states in the United States. So in 2 of those, in Pennsylvania and Michigan, there's a reasonably large constituency of Arab Americans. And if they don't vote, I don't think they're going to vote for Trump, but if they withhold their votes from Harris because of her support for Israel and its campaign in Gaza, which has led to so many civilian deaths, that could potentially have an impact on the election. But I'd say overall, I think the interesting conclusion is both these candidates, they've done a lot of focus groups, they've traveled the country, they understand where the electorate is, and I think their comments reflect that the Americans don't want wars. They want a leader who can prevent wars, can stop wars. They both candidates say they want a strong U.S. military, but really neither of them is campaigning on increasing the defense budget, despite the military challenges that we face around the world.
Yeah, you've been talking about importance in these elections. America, projecting its power to the world, American leadership, but American people, do they really want it? Because we see all over again and again the more isolationism, not coming from a MAGA or not coming from Trump, but from American people. So basically, is this somehow influencing the elections that people want maybe something different?
Yeah, I'd say I wouldn't call it isolationism actually, but maybe more selective engagement overseas, and a real focus on building strength at home. I think what people sometimes associate with isolationism is the shift in the U.S. approach to the economy, the global economy, and in favor. There was a consensus in favor of globalization for economic efficiency and integration. That has changed quite quickly to a consensus in the United States and in other countries to sort of national and economic security, which is a form of protectionism. And I see people look at that and say, well, that's isolationism. I think actually it's a reflection of sort of the great power competition that is going on, and really the fear that great powers have of each other, both economically and militarily. And that's been building up for some time in the United States. On economic issues, the perception that industries and jobs have gone abroad because of this, global free market. The financial crisis back in 2008, undermined confidence in free markets. And then people look at China and its real push, for the last 15 years or so, and to create its own domestic strategic industries that are really not reliant on the West and can compete with the West and even create dependencies for the West. So you've got that whole set of issues, and then you've got security issues where you've seen, China become much more active militarily in the South China Sea, pressure on Taiwan, rapid increase in its own defense capabilities, and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 10 years ago in 2014, annexation of Crimea and Donbass. So I think in general, certainly the United States sees the world as a much more unstable, threatening place. And so there's an attempt to control that through intervention in markets, restrictions, the sanctions, export controls, investment screening, tariffs, subsidies for strategic industries. And I think, frankly, this is going to go on a long time. I think we're at the early stages of it. I don't see, we don't see exactly how it's going to play out, but I think it's going to go on for a long time, this new normal.
You have already told about the majority of US voters would like to end all wars in the world. They would like to see the peace. But when we look at the situation in Europe, and especially what's going on in Ukraine, we are interested. What is your opinion? What should we here in Europe expect from Trump and Harris regarding this conflict? This is the first question. And the second question is, what are the possible scenarios in both cases?
Yeah, so I was involved in this conflict back when, the previous beginning of it, back in 2014. I was at the State Department, responsible for Russia and Europe as number 2 for Europe and Eurasia, the State Department. So I saw how this unfolded from the beginning. I think now this war is at a really critical moment, as you see Russia and Ukraine jockeying for military position, political position, specifically ahead of the next U.S. administration. Trump's goal, clearly, as he said many, many times, is to end the war through negotiations, to avoid further casualties, and to avoid the risk of Russia using nuclear weapons, which he's pointed to a number of times. But the question comes: what if Zelensky and Putin can't agree on a despite Trump's pressure? Trump will not want to look like he lost or gave up Ukraine. There's considerable support in the Republican Party for Ukraine, I'd say particularly in Congress for Ukraine. And it's also important to consider, even if he's able to make some sort of settlement, it's going to be temporary as long as Putin is in power, which is probably the rest of his life, because Putin considers Ukraine part of Russia. And I think he'll look for future opportunities, even if the conflict may settle down. Harris, I think, is most likely going to support Ukraine in the same way the Biden administration has. But I think there'll be some fundamental questions coming up next year. One is she going to go beyond what President Biden has done, which I don't think has been very effective, in making a stronger case to the American people on the threat posed by Russia and the reasons for helping Ukraine? Because next year, in 2025, Ukraine's going to need more funding. And it's going to be very challenging to get that approved by the U.S. Congress, despite the large support I mentioned. But the way Congress works, when it's closely divided, it's easy for a few people to disrupt, as we saw with the delay in funding this past year. So her leadership is going to be really required, and she will have to spend political capital, I think, in a way that even President Biden hasn't had to do. It's interesting that not so long ago, Ukraine was a consensus issue in the United States and in Europe as well. And now the polling indicates it's divisive. So 60% of Democrats say that the United States should do more to help Ukraine, and 75% of Republicans say they oppose assistance to Ukraine. So it's going to be very tricky and require a lot of effort and leadership from a President Harris or a President Trump in 2025.
Yeah, Hansa is missing again. So let's move maybe to the Middle East, because we are in the half of our discussion, and the situation in the Middle East deteriorated rapidly over the past few weeks. Now we see there is also war in Lebanon. There was a massive rocket strike from Iran to Israel. So how do you think that this conflict will evolve in the coming months? Is it possible at all to solve it peacefully or not?
Well, I think there's a serious risk right now of a regional war as Israel tries to finish the job against the Iranian proxies that have long threatened it. Israel has accomplished some remarkable things against the leadership of Hamas in recent days, putting Iran on edge. Against Hezbollah, which in Lebanon, putting Iran on edge, and it's made progress against Hamas in Gaza. But these are coming at huge civilian costs, a lot of condemnation in the world, and it's unclear what Israel's political strategies is to actually end these conflicts, even if it makes military progress. I think what's oftentimes not recognized, at least here in Washington so much, is that, for Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, this is not necessarily, it's not a good moment, but it's not necessarily going in a bad direction for them. They know that a war of attrition is not Israel's strength or its military doctrine. And I think they take some, solace. They think it's a good thing that Hamas has punctured sort of the aura of invincibility that Israel had through its horrendous, attack a year ago. And even, while Israel is able to intercept, virtually all of Iranian and Hezbollah missiles, they can't intercept all of them, and that is leaving Israelis with a feeling of risk in their homes, and that's what Iran and its proxies want. What I think, though, is that it's really becoming an existential conflict. It's really becoming an us versus them, which you don't see very much path toward a diplomatic solution or a ceasefire or how it ends anytime soon. And I think these set of wars, or this, God forbid, regional war, is going to have a generational impact on the Middle East, on Europe, and in the United States. I think that the next generation of Americans who come to political power, not yet in political power, are really going to look at Israel very differently than they have in the past. And it's unclear exactly how that's going to play out, but I think it'll be impactful.
Elections are here in less than a month, new administration less than 3 months. So it's very probable, unfortunately, that whether we call it conflict or war in the Middle East, it will basically, next administration will inherit it. And whether it's going to be Kamala Harris or whether it's going to be Donald Trump, they have some experience, or in their teams, there are people who are very experienced with Middle East. On one side of the aisle, in Kamala Harris's camp, there is a Philip Gordon, who was instrumental for a so-called JCPOA, let's call it Iran deal. On the other side, Trump himself and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they were instrumental in Abraham Accords, sort of like de-escalation and, sort of like détente among few Arab countries and Israel. So how you think Kamala Harris or Donald Trump will respond with their experience to this conflict?
I don't see really fundamental differences between how a Trump administration or Harris administration is going to approach these conflicts for the Middle East. Their rhetoric will differ, and maybe the tools they use will differ. But as far as the two sort of initiatives you spoke about, the Abraham Accords, for example, which was a very successful initiative of the Trump administration, working with allies in the Middle East or partners in the Middle East. The Biden administration picked that up and made a lot of progress toward a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which seemed to be on track, except for until it was undermined by Hamas's attack on Israel, triggering this war in Gaza. And what that did was it sort of compelled Saudi Arabia to make a stronger condition on Israel's support for a two-state solution, for a Palestinian state, than was the case prior to the war in Gaza. And Israel does not support a two-state solution. So hasn't come to fruition, but that is probably going to continue to be a U.S. approach under either administration. And then on Iran, I think there's a perception of a great deal of difference between Trump and Obama and Biden. But if you listen specifically to what Trump says about Iran, is that he could, he doesn't like this JCPOA, this agreement on nuclear weapons, but that he could negotiate a better deal with more pressure on Iran. And so it's not a fundamentally different approach. He's even, spoken about how he doesn't object to Iran as long as they have no nuclear weapons. He's been actually kind of careful in avoiding war and conflict with Iran, specifically back in 2019 when Iran provoked a number of incidents, including a direct attack on Saudi Arabia. So I see both administrations looking to be active players in the Middle East, but really seeking to avoid or prevent or reduce any war armed conflict.
Maybe I would join this part of discussion with our last part, which would be devoted to Asia, and I would like to know China played or has been playing a greater role in the Middle East, especially in the last years. It played a great role in the normalization of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I would like to know. Is it in the power of China to play a peaceful role in the Middle East, for example, to be like a key player or something like that? Maybe replace. Sorry, maybe in some kind to replace United States, the role of United States in the Middle East. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I don't think China can replace the role of the United States. I mean, for one thing, the United States has a preponderance of military power in the Middle East through its bases and through its partnership and relationships there. That China doesn't have. I mean, with a small military facility in Djibouti. So just on the hard power side, the ability to deter, the ability to play an active role. You don't see China playing an active role in trying to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza or Hezbollah. You see them taking sort of rhetorical advantage of the situation, criticizing the United States for allegedly being a contributor to these conflicts. But you don't see them playing a role. They did play, as you mentioned, an important role in the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But that was a case in which those two countries wanted to normalize. And so it really was a facilitation role. It wasn't a role in which they were brought to the table. The economic pull of China, I think, is significant. And we see that particularly in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. China is and I think part of the tension in the region comes from, the aspirations of UAE and Saudi Arabia to be, global players on AI, on data centers, on next generation computing ability, which their energy resources, their financial resources allow them to aim for. They will have to make decisions when it comes to a certain high level of technology between the United States and China, because you can't sort of mix those two systems. We've seen there's a decoupling at the highest levels of technology. I think it's most likely they will stick with the United States, but events on the ground could raise questions about that.
If I would move or reformulate Dan's question, you talk mostly about hard power and also focus on China only, but we see fragmentation of the world. I don't want to talk about duopoly. It's not like Cold War of the past, Soviet Union versus United States, but still we see fragmentation in economy through G7 and BRICS on the other side. Not only now BRICS trying to create their own Bretton Woods system institution, so Asian investment institutions, they are trying to invest together. They would like to be more independent on World Bank, International Monetary Fund and their rules. We can talk about role of not only China but other BRIC players in Africa. We can talk about China sending dual purpose material to Russia. Don't you think that there is sort of, yes, in hard power US has a primacy for sure, but in economic world, don't you see sort of like parity between or creating these kind of two blocks? And if yes, how US, and now I'm talking not only about president but US Treasury, Fed, etc., how they shall respond to this?
Yeah, thanks. I don't really see blocks, as you mentioned at the beginning, or any ability of the BRICS to challenge the Bretton Woods, the institutional arrangement that the world lives under today, albeit not as easily and in a more fragmented sense. But I think the interesting thing that you alluded to is the rise of sort of activist middle powers that we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years. These are countries that have the resources, because of sort of the rise of the rest, have agency, want to decide on their own interests and not just follow one of the global powers. So I'm thinking of India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, as we were talking about before. Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, Angola. I mean, there are many more, but these are countries that some of them are in BRICS, and they may want to cooperate on certain issues. I think it's very unlikely that they're going to coalesce behind China, uh, in any new economic system for the world. But I do think that the U.S. approach has to become much more sophisticated to these countries. I think the United States was surprised that after sort of an initial, general condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many of these countries were not very willing to follow up on that. They weren't very receptive to the West and the U.S. argument that we have to protect this rules-based international order, because they don't really see that international order as existing, or if it does, it favors the G7. So I think we need to have as I mentioned, sort of a review of the role these partners are able to play in the world, and to rethink our diplomacy and our communications with many of these countries, which are sort of loosely termed the global South. And I think that China is very much along the same lines. They're seeking to engage more with these countries, not solely through the BRICS.
Yeah, no doubt China is a rising power, probably now the second most powerful nation globally. But we could see, in the case of China, changes in its diplomatic line, like when, for example, Qin Gang became the foreign minister in China. It changed the wolf warrior diplomacy line back to more open relationships. But when he was replaced by Wang Yi again, so the wolf warrior diplomacy is back again. Is China at all able, or has enough skills to be, or to create a real bloc which will be competitive to United States?
That's where China isn't so strong, and they say that it's not their goal either. I mean, there's been much focus here in Washington on sort of what was called by some columnists the axis of upheaval. That is the growing relationship between China and Russia, and also Iran and North Korea. That's not a very influential global bloc, but they can support each other, particularly in some military and technology, and disruptive. Really, is why we call it axis of upheaval, in a disruption of the current global system. I think clearly the United States and China, the U.S.-China relationship is the defining relationship of the global order for this generation, and I think what has unnerved China a little bit is that the Biden administration has been really remarkably successful at sort of creating a growing lattice work of allies in particularly in the Pacific. Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia, which have always been allies, but they're working together in ways that they haven't done before. And this is, both due to, good diplomacy from the Biden administration, but fundamentally a concern about China's rise in its activities. And and as well as with partners like India, Taiwan, several in Southeast Asia. And this is on economic coordination, it's on security. And it's the mantra is one that was coined by former Prime Minister Abe in Japan, is that the goal is a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a very compelling vision for the countries of the Pacific. I don't think China has that sort of compelling vision. It has very strong trade relationships. Countries want to work with China. It has investment capability, and that won't go away. But I don't see China creating sort of a competing bloc, even on sort of currency. It's a long way from there.
You just answered part of my next question, because if we try to sort of summarize into few bullet points relationship between United States and China, we can talk about alliance building. You just talk about it for sure. Then there is a problem of trade, especially bilateral trade, and then there is a problem of one China policy, ipso facto problem of Taiwan. So alliance you already mentioned. And then these two factors, it's obvious when you read international press and also you read conversation on a hill and both camps, both the Republicans and Democrats, that the key problem is not Taiwan. Key is a trade. Catherine Tai, as a current U.S. trade administrator, every regulation that now Joe Biden as a president was doing, when Biden says, "Hey, I will put 100% tariff on Chinese EV," then Trump said, "I will do 200%." So it seems that the trade is the defining factor of bilateral relation. Do you see it that way? That's sort of like problem of Taiwan. Yes, let's sell weapons, let's be friendly, but that it's sort of like secondary or even tertiary. The most emblematic important is the trade, then alliance building, and then Taiwan. Do you see this kind of hierarchization?
I wouldn't personally put it in terms of a hierarchy, but I agree with you completely that trade, how to trade with China, we can't stop trading with China. We're too dependent on each other for trade. Our economies are intertwined. How to regulate investment into China, is a question that's, we've been at, but it's not answered yet. And I think actually what you're going to see after the U.S. elections is these trade tensions are going to really amp up, because I think China has sort of been holding back on retaliation that it would like to, that it believes is necessary, because it doesn't want to become too much of an issue in the U.S. election. And I think especially if Trump puts what he has said, a special tariff on everything coming from China of 60%, that will create an enormous quick retaliation that we didn't see from China in previous trade wars. And I think China will frankly test President Harris if she wins the election in a number of ways. And so I think you could see a real flare up in this really important area, and testing the notion, can we limit it to what the Biden administration has called a small yard with a high fence, being super regulated in terms of trade. This is high technology, advanced technologies, future strategic industries, or is it going to become much more widespread, which I think is what you alluded to and what Trump has talked about. Taiwan, I think, remains a really a really critical issue. So I wouldn't put it too far down below. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done more than anything to motivate the United States, its allies, and Taiwan to prepare seriously to deter a possible Chinese military pressure attack on Taiwan. And I think that has probably pushed out the window that China, had, people had been interpreting was a possibility of as soon as 2027, which is when Xi told his military to be ready. Perhaps that's pushed out a couple of years. But I think, going back to the economic thing, the nearer term risk, the much more likely scenario is China using economic coercion combined with cyber attacks to undermine Taiwan, hopefully below aiming to hit below the threshold of U.S. Or allied intervention. I think that can get caught up in the broader issue of trade and investment, how our countries relate to each other, if we see China using that kind of economic coercion on Taiwan.
Okay, so last question is on my side again, and I would end up, who of the both candidates in the U.S. presidential election is, in your opinion, the most preferable variant for China?
For China, I was just listening shortly before to a little podcast on the Middle East, and among and I've heard this before from other analysts. A very eminent analyst was saying, I think it's a wash between for the Gulf countries. They don't have a preference. I I can't predict what I don't know what's going on in the mind of China. I think China. I would interpret it as saying I think Chinese leadership, was looking forward perhaps to a change in administration from the Trump administration, which was very unpredictable. I think China, doesn't like unpredictability in the bilateral relationship, and was trying to, seek ways to stabilize. They think another administration is going to be perhaps less likely to use some of the tools that the Trump administration used. And then they found out that the next administration was actually just Yes, likely to use some of those tools, maintained a lot of those tools, and then built this, or strengthened this network of alliances. So my guess would be that they really don't know which president, which party in power, and I think their more important consideration is that there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States that we need to be clearer, deter China militarily, constrain some of China's economic activities. And I don't think that differs a lot between administration, other than the tools and maybe the rhetoric.
Great.
Thank you, Paul, for being with us. Last 40 minutes, we talked to Ambassador Paul Jones, former U.S. ambassador to Malaysia, Poland, chargé d'affaires to Pakistan, and currently working at the global leadership of Square, Patton and Box. Thanks, sir, for being with us.
Hey, it was a real pleasure. Delighted to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you very much.